All right, good morning, everybody. Today we are going to look at what are called the cycles of matter. We've already kind of touched on this a little bit in some of our previous lessons, but we didn't really talk about it as the cycles. We just referred to them as what was actually happening in them. So here's what I want you to think about first. I've got a food chain here, so one that we've already seen before. And remember that it starts at the bottom with corn or maize, and energy gets passed up to the snake. Now, what happens to that snake? Does anything eat it? Well, it doesn't necessarily or typically have any predators that normally would eat it, so we call this a top carnivore. But if the energy is all passed along here through food, well, what happens to the rest of the food? Right? What happens to the rest of the material that makes up that food that isn't being used for energy? Well, there are a couple of things that are going to happen. Number one, the snake, when it's done digesting food and has gotten everything out of it, it's gotten all the nutrients it needs out of it, it's going to ingest what it doesn't need. So that would just be excreted as waste. But then what happens when it dies? What happens to everything that makes up this snake if it's not eaten? What happens if it just dies of natural causes? What happens if it, just grows old? Well, are all of the parts just lost to the universe? Does the Earth just lose all of those resources? Well, no, of course not. That's where what are called decomposers come into play. All right, so you can see some examples over to the right. The whole point or purpose to decomposers is they digest waste, such as urine, feces, and the bodies of dead organisms to get their energy. In other words, they recycle, right? So the things that other organisms get rid of and don't need, they can use as fuel. And as well, when things grow old and die and are just left to rot, that rotting process is decomposers at work. So we have some examples of soil insects, mushrooms, molds, earthworms, bacteria. Any of these qualify as decomposers because they are either eating or ingesting urine, feces, or breaking down dead organisms into smaller and smaller particles. So as they digest, what they do is they break down the substances and they release those nutrients. So things like carbon, nitrogen, or iron. And conveniently, those can now be used. They can now be taken in and used by other organisms. And most specifically, we're pretty much only talking about plants, but it also does get used by other bacteria and other smaller organisms. But the primary one we're talking about are plants. So now those nutrients can be taken in by plants, and then they can be used by the plants, and then those plants can be eaten, and then what eats those plants can be eaten, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see that these nutrients, these things that are broken down and released into, generally or more typically, the soil or into the ground, can then be cycled back through our food chain. All right. So the first major particle or the first major element that we're going to talk about as a cycle is the carbon cycle. Now, we have already talked about this in a fair amount of detail. Photosynthesis, respiration. All right, this cycle between photosynthesis and respiration, back and forth and back and forth. Remember those two processes. So photosynthesis, we have carbon dioxide and water being taken in by the plant, and they use the energy of the sun to convert it into sugar and oxygen. And then plants or animals can then take in that sugar and oxygen and excrete it into the atmosphere. And then that can go back and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So that is the fundamental basis for the carbon cycle. All right. Now there are other pathways that can be followed. Plants don't just release glucose, sugar into the air. They have to be eaten, but they also die. Right. So when a plant dies, it will fall to the ground if it's a tree, or it will just start to rot, and that's the organisms, the decomposers, taking those plants and breaking them down into smaller particles, and then those nutrients end up in the soil, which can then be taken up by another plant, and then that plant can grow, and that plant will respire, and that will release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and then we cycle again. Now, as I said, plants don't just take that glucose and get eaten, they can also die, but other points along the path, things can die as well. So this animal might have eaten the plant, so the glucose is now in here, the carbon is now in this animal, and it's going to undergo cellular respiration, and it's going to release carbon dioxide into the air, but it too could also die, and it could be broken down by decomposers, and then all the nutrients end up in the soil, and then they can be taken in by plants. All right? Now, there is one extreme result for these nutrients going into the soil, and that is over very, very long periods of time, they end up forming fossils and fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are what we use in factories. It's what we use in cars. And when those fossil fuels are burned, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Right? So we've got a couple of different sources for carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. Two of them natural, so animals and plants undergoing cellular respiration, taking glucose in, breaking it down, and releasing it into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But we also have this new man-made factor, right? So this part of the cycle right here has been around for billions of years, and it's been doing it quite nicely for that period of time. But now we've got this one more extra thing that adds more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And next year, when you take grade 10 science, you'll go into a little bit of climate change, and this will become important for it. All right, so that's the carbon cycle. The next one is what's called the nitrogen cycle. Now, I understand there's a lot going on here. We're only going to look at a couple little small parts to it. All right, so the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is important because we require it in our muscles, we require it in our cells, so it's an important part of protein. So the ability of us to take in nitrogen is very important. The problem is, despite the fact that the air around us is 78% nitrogen, so most of the air that you are breathing in right now is nitrogen, we can't actually absorb it from the air. And we don't have that physical capability. So we have to get our nitrogen from other sources, and we get that from eating. So we eat things like protein, we eat things like meat. Now, that nitrogen had to find a way into the food, though. Right? So we look at our food chains. At some point along the way, nitrogen had to be absorbed in there. So let's take a quick look at where that nitrogen is coming from. So we've got nitrogen in the air. There are a number of different ways that nitrogen can get into the ground, right? It's called nitrogen fixation. Now, we're not going to go into any details on them because how that happens or what specifically is doing it isn't really important. What we just need to understand is that nitrogen in the air can be, by bacteria or through lightning, put into the soil, right? So what happens is you end up with the creation of a couple of molecules called ammonium and ammonia. Now, through a series of a couple of processes, we have bacteria that will then convert that into nitrates. And the nitrates are what are important because these nitrates are what can be absorbed by plants out of the ground. So now we had nitrogen in the air. We have a couple of ways that it can get into the ground. And then after bacteria do their job on it, plants can then absorb it. All right, so this absorbed nitrogen in the form of what are called nitrates now becomes part of the plants, and then we can eat them, other animals can eat them, and then they can be used for things like muscles. Okay? Now, when plants or animals die, those can get put back into the ground, and then they can be re-entered into the nitrogen cycle. Okay? So, why are we looking at these cycles? Why are they important? Well, back to biodiversity again. If biodiversity gets disrupted, then that means those cycles get disrupted. There are a number of different organisms that are important for each one. If we lose plants, that means that We don't have the carbon cycle working properly because we don't have photosynthesis working properly. We also don't have the nitrogen cycle working properly because those plants need to pull the nitrogen out of the soil so that other organisms can then eat them, and we can eat them and get the nitrogen that we so desperately need to survive. So biodiversity, again, is very important. If those cycles get disrupted, it affects all living creatures, including us. All right? So a simple plant dying, or a simple species of plants dying, can cause a very drastic effect on other organisms. Now, let's look at a specific example. You may have heard of algae before, but we're going to talk about what are called algal blooms. So if we end up with, as opposed to not enough of something, what happens if we have too much nitrogen ending up in the soil? Now, this can happen fairly easily, in particular in farm areas, if there is too much fertilizer used. So it can get washed into the rivers and lakes by the rain. All right. Now, what happens is then it ends up being pooled or accumulating in a particular area, and that causes what's called an algal bloom, because algae love nitrogen. So we have areas where an enormous amount of nitrogen accumulates. That means the algae will grow quickly, and you end up with something that looks like this. So you can see that is a boat. All right, so there's a boat, tiny little boat with some people on it, and this huge area of green, that is all algae on some body of water. So this is a lake, or it would have to be a lake because of the size. So you can see this looks like a big blanket of green, and that, in a sense, is what it is. It is a blanket of algae, and that's blocking the sunlight from getting into the water, and it's blocking most of the oxygen from getting into the water. No oxygen and no sunlight means things die. Right? So what ends up happening is the other organisms that live in that area end up starving, and they die. And so that ends up leading to the death of the entire system. So a simple fertilizer can cause the death of an entire ecosystem just because too much fertilizer was used. And so obviously these cycles can be fairly easily disrupted. So it's potentially a very dangerous thing. So what other factors could affect these cycles? What other things can happen naturally or that we do can affect how those cycles work? Well, that'll be the next lesson. But before that, you've got a worksheet to do in the assignment section. Go do that, and then come back and you can look at the next section.